Right now this week, there are cars on Facebook Marketplace and Gumtree in this country, listed for less than a weekly food shop. Not broken, not scrap, just unwanted, forgotten or attached to a badge nobody's chasing anymore. 10 of them, and what's actually wrong with each one, if anything. The first thing to understand before the list itself: cars go free, or close to it, for one of 3 reasons. Fear of a specific fault that's usually cheaper to fix than people assume, a badge that's fallen completely out of fashion, or an owner who simply needs it gone faster than the market would otherwise price it. Almost none of these reasons relate to the actual mechanical condition underneath, which is exactly why this list exists. There's a 4th reason too, less common but worth flagging before we start, which is simple bad timing on the seller's end. Someone moving abroad in 3 weeks, someone who's inherited a car they never wanted, someone whose new job comes with a company vehicle attached. None of those situations have anything to do with what the car itself is worth, and all of them produce listings priced to move immediately rather than priced to reflect genuine condition. Keep an eye out for that kind of desperation in the wording of a listing, because it's often a far bigger factor in a bargain price than anything mechanical. The Citroen C4, first generation, diesel, is currently one of the most consistently underpriced cars on the entire second-hand market. The reputation for complex hydraulic and electronic systems that dogs bigger Citroens barely applies here, since the C4 uses conventional suspension throughout. But the badge stigma applies anyway, indiscriminately, to every Citroen, regardless of what's actually underneath. Sellers routinely list these for £200 or less, simply because nobody's bidding. And a well-serviced example with the 1.6 HDI engine will comfortably do another 80,000 miles without complaint. I've watched one of these sit on a marketplace listing for 3 weeks at £150, viewed dozens of times, ignored every single time, purely because the description started with the word Citroen and nobody read past it to notice the service history attached below. The Rover 45, any diesel variant, sits in an even worse position than most Rovers, because the company's collapse happened while this model was still relatively current, and that timing baked genuine panic into how people perceive it. The diesel engine, licensed from BMW during the period when the two companies still shared ownership, has nothing whatsoever to do with why Rover as a business failed. These sell for pocket change specifically because sellers assume nobody wants a car from a dead brand, and they're usually right, which is precisely the opportunity. A relative of mine bought a Rover 45 diesel 8 years ago for £80 as a genuine joke, expecting it to die within the month. It's still on the road now, still doing the same 20-mile commute 5 days a week, having asked for nothing beyond tyres, brakes, and the occasional service. The Fiat Stilo, particularly the multi-wagon estate version with the JTD diesel, gets dismissed almost entirely on styling grounds rather than mechanical ones. Nobody ever loved how it looked. That's cost the car serious money on the used market for 2 decades running, while the JTD diesel underneath quietly built a reputation among people who actually drove them daily as one of the more dependable Fiat engines of its era. Expect to pay less than the cost of a full tank of fuel in a modern SUV. What's genuinely notable about the Stilo specifically is how consistently it gets dismissed sight unseen. Buyers scroll past the listing photo, decide instantly that the styling isn't for them, and never get as far as reading that the JTD engine underneath was co-developed with Fiat's motorsport-adjacent engineering division and shares real technical lineage with genuinely respected diesel units from the same era. The styling killed the car commercially when new. It's now the exact same reason you can buy one for almost nothing. The Daewoo Nubira, later rebadged as the Chevrolet Nubira depending on the exact year, might be the single most anonymous car ever sold in Britain. Built on Vauxhall-derived underpinnings during Daewoo's ownership period, it inherited genuinely sound General Motors engineering, wrapped in a badge nobody's ever felt any attachment to. These are essentially given away now because there's no community, no forum, no enthusiast base keeping demand alive. Just an honest, mid-sized saloon that does exactly what it says with no drama whatsoever. I sold one of these on behalf of an elderly client last year, and it took genuine effort just to get anyone to view it, despite full service history and a genuinely low mileage for its age. It eventually went for £60 to a student who needed anything with 4 wheels and a valid MOT, and by every account I've heard since, it's been utterly faultless. The Proton Wira, largely forgotten now, was built on licensed Mitsubishi Lancer underpinnings during the 90s, which means the mechanical bones underneath the unfamiliar badge are considerably more reputable than most buyers realize. Surviving examples are rare at this point, mostly because so few were ever sold here in the first place, but the handful still circulating tend to go for prices that reflect the badge's total lack of recognition rather than the genuinely solid, Japanese-derived engineering underneath. If you've stayed with me this far, you're clearly someone who cares more about what's actually under the bonnet than what's stamped on the badge above it, which is a genuinely rare quality in how most people shop for cars. That's worth acknowledging before we carry on. The Ssangyong Rodius, an SUV so awkwardly styled it became something of a running joke when new, has quietly become one of the cheapest 7-seat vehicles available on the entire used market as a direct result of that reputation. The Mercedes-sourced diesel engine fitted to various generations gives it genuine mechanical credibility that the styling completely fails to communicate, and buyers who can look past the awkward proportions find a genuinely spacious, genuinely tough family vehicle selling for a fraction of what equivalent seating capacity costs from any fashionable badge. The Mercedes connection specifically came from a period when Ssangyong had a formal engineering partnership arrangement, licensing engines and certain drivetrain components rather than developing everything independently, which explains why a budget Korean SUV ended up with genuinely respected German mechanical DNA running through it. Almost nobody shopping the used SUV market knows this detail, and that gap in public knowledge is worth roughly £4,000 to whoever happens to find out before making a decision. A large family I know specifically sought one out after being quoted absurd prices for equivalent 7-seat capacity from mainstream manufacturers, and they've now covered 3 years of daily use, school runs, and holiday trips without a single complaint, having paid less for the entire vehicle than most families spend on a single set of replacement tires for something more fashionable. The Kia Magentis, an early Kia saloon sold before the brand earned the reputation it now enjoys, exists in an odd gap where it's too old to benefit from Kia's modern turnaround in public perception, but too obscure to have built any following of its own. The engines underneath, straightforward and conservatively engineered, tend to outlast the car's total lack of resale value by a considerable margin, making this one of the purest examples on this list of a car worth more as transport than as an asset. There's something almost poetic about a car that arrived just early enough to miss out on the reputation its own manufacturer would go on to earn a decade later. Buy a modern Kia today, and you're paying a premium partly built on the brand's hard-won reliability image. Buy a Magentis, and you get the underlying engineering discipline that eventually built that image, minus the premium, minus the recognition, minus almost the entire price. The Vauxhall Signum, essentially a stretched, more practical Vectra that never found an audience, because buyers couldn't quite work out what it was supposed to be, suffered from confused marketing far more than any actual mechanical shortcoming. The diesel variants share their engines with well-regarded contemporary Vauxhalls and Saabs from the same corporate family, and because almost nobody remembers the Signum exists at all, prices have collapsed to essentially nothing for a car that offers genuinely useful practicality. Vauxhall itself never quite worked out how to sell it, positioning it somewhere between an estate and an executive saloon without committing fully to either identity, and that internal confusion at the marketing stage has followed the car ever since. Ask 10 people what a Vauxhall Signum actually is, and most won't be able to picture it at all, despite it being a perfectly sound, spacious, well-engineered vehicle that simply never found the right sentence to describe itself in an advert. The Chrysler Voyager, particularly the diesel variants built during Chrysler's period of European partnership, gets tarred by a general skepticism toward American engineering that, in this specific case, doesn't reflect what's actually under the bonnet. Several generations used engines sourced through European partnerships rather than built entirely in-house, which means the drivetrain reliability doesn't always match the brand's broader American reputation. Large, practical, and almost universally overlooked, these regularly appear on marketplace listings for whatever the seller can get before their tax and MOT run out. The 7-seat capacity alone would command a serious premium, under almost any other badge. And yet families searching specifically for cheap, spacious transport routinely walk straight past these listings, put off entirely by assumptions about American reliability that, in this particular case, simply don't hold up against the actual engineering underneath. The 10th entry on this list isn't really a specific model at all, but a category worth knowing about regardless. Any diesel estate or saloon from a manufacturer that's since exited the UK market entirely. Cars like the last-generation Daewoo range, discontinued Proton models, or early Chinese imports that arrived briefly before their parent companies withdrew from Britain altogether. These vehicles carry zero resale value specifically because there's no ongoing brand presence to maintain interest, no dealership network to service a reputation, and no marketing budget defending the badge's image. What that abandonment leaves behind is often a mechanically sound vehicle sold purely for what a buyer will pay to remove it from someone's driveway. I'd add a practical note to this specific category since it's broader and slightly riskier than the named models above it. Parts availability becomes the genuine deciding factor once a brand has fully withdrawn from a market. So before committing to anything in this final category, check specifically whether an independent specialist or online parts network still supports the model, rather than assuming a dealership network you can simply walk into. Plenty of these orphaned brands are still well supported by dedicated importers and specialist forums, even decades after the badge vanished from British showrooms. And that support is what actually determines whether ownership stays cheap or turns into a scavenger hunt. There's a pattern worth sitting with across every single one of these 10. In each case, the price collapsed for a reason that has nothing to do with the engine, the gearbox, or the fundamental soundness of the vehicle. Badge collapse, styling misjudgment, brand anonymity, corporate withdrawal, confused marketing. None of those things affect whether a well-built diesel engine keeps running, and yet all of them affect price far more dramatically than actual mechanical condition ever does. If you're the kind of buyer who can separate what a car is worth to strangers from what it's actually capable of doing for you personally, this entire list represents one of the strangest inefficiencies left in the British used car market. Every single one of these 10 cars will get you to work, get you to the shops, get your kids to school, exactly as reliably as something costing 10 times the price, purely because the badge on the front has fallen out of everyone else's favour while nobody bothered checking what was still working perfectly underneath it. It's worth remembering that market price and mechanical worth are two entirely separate measurements, and only one of them actually matters once you're the person sitting in the driver's seat every morning. The used car market prices badges, styling and fashion far more aggressively than it prices engineering, and that mismatch is precisely where every single entry on this list lives. Nobody's going to admire you in a car park for owning a Rover 45 or a Ssangyong Rodius, but nobody's going to be stranded on the hard shoulder in one either. And for most people, most of the time, that trade is worth infinitely more than a badge anyone else would recognize. Worth remembering the next time a listing price makes you assume something must be seriously wrong. Sometimes it isn't wrong at all. Sometimes it's just unloved.